Welcome to Mystic Sleep Tales, and thank you for being here tonight. Wherever you are listening from, whatever the hour may be, allow yourself a moment now to settle. Let the weight of the day begin to leave your shoulders. If you are lying down, feel how the surface beneath you holds you gently, how it asks nothing of you in return. If your eyes are still open, you may close them whenever you feel ready, and if they're already closed, then you're already one step closer to the quiet place we're going together. Take a long, slow breath in through your nose, hold it for just a moment, and let it go. Feel how your chest falls, how the air leaves you so easily and without effort, how the body knows, without instruction, how to do this one simple thing over and over again. Take another breath, and this time, as you exhale, imagine the small concerns of the day, the list of things done and undone, the conversations half remembered, the minor irritations that clung to you like dust on a sleeve. Imagine all of those rising gently away from you, carried upward on that breath and dissolving into nothing at all. You do not need them now. You do not need anything at all except the sound of this voice, which will stay with you as long as you need it, and which you may leave behind whenever sleep finds you. Let your hands rest where they are, and notice how still they can be when there is nothing to hold and nothing to do. Let your jaw soften. Let your tongue rest against the floor of your mouth. If there is any tightness in your forehead, let it smooth itself out slowly, the way a crease in linen disappears under a warm hand. You are safe. You are still. And now, very gently, we're going to go somewhere together, somewhere quiet and warm, somewhere very far from the noise of the ordinary world, though it is in truth only a short distance away down a narrow street in London on a cold December evening in the year 1893. The workshop occupied the ground floor of a narrow brick building on a side street just south of Clerkenwell Road, in that part of London where small trades and solitary crafts had persisted for generations in rooms that were rarely visited by anyone but the men who worked in them. The building itself was unremarkable from the outside. 3 stories of London stock brick, a single door of dark painted wood, and 2 windows at street level whose lower halves were covered by muslin curtains that had gone the color of old tea. Above the door, a wooden sign, its lettering just barely legible beneath years of grime. Red Hargrove and Son, ornamental glass. Though the elder Hargrove had been dead for 6 years, and the son, whose name was Edmund, now worked entirely alone. Inside, the workshop was a single room roughly 18 feet by 12, with a ceiling that followed the underside of the floor above, its beams darkened by years of furnace heat, and the fine residue of glass dust that settled on every surface and gave the air a faintly mineral quality, like standing too close to a cold river. The floor was flagstone, swept clean each evening, but never entirely free of the glittering particles that caught the lamplight and made the stone appear to shift with tiny, moving points of brightness. Along the far wall, a row of glass sheets leaned in their wooden racks, standing upright like the pages of some enormous, translucent book, each one resting against its neighbor with a sheet of soft cloth between them to prevent scratching. Some of these panes were clear plate glass, awaiting their first mark. Others bore the beginnings of designs, their surfaces partially covered with the dark, tar-like coating of Brunswick black, the acid-resistant paint through which the artisan would scratch his patterns before exposing them to the etching fumes. The furnace stood against the right-hand wall, a squat, cast-iron structure with a flue that ran up through the ceiling and out into the cold air above. Earlier in the day, it had been necessary to heat several pots of tallow to prepare the acid trays, and the warmth from that firing still lingered in the brickwork and in the air itself, giving the room a temperature that was markedly gentler than the December evening outside. Now the furnace had been turned down to its lowest setting, its iron door slightly ajar, and a faint amber glow leaked through the gap and spread across the floor in a thin band of light that reached almost to the center of the room before fading into the deeper shadows. That faint glow was enough to give the whole space a sense of warmth that had nothing to do with actual temperature, a suggestion of embers still breathing, of heat not yet entirely spent. Edmund Hargrove stood at his workbench, which ran the length of the left-hand wall beneath one of the two street-facing windows. He was a man of 41, neither tall nor short, with the sort of lean, patient build that suggested a life spent standing and bending rather than lifting or hauling. His hands, which were his most distinguishing feature, were long-fingered and steady, the nails kept short and clean despite the nature of his work, and the tips of his fingers bore the particular smoothness that comes from years of handling glass, a surface worn so fine that fingerprints had become almost invisible in certain lights. He wore a plain woolen waistcoat over a collarless shirt, the sleeves of which were rolled to the elbow despite the season, and around his waist was tied a leather apron of the sort used by men in trades where sharp materials and corrosive substances were a daily concern. Before him on the bench lay a small window pane, roughly 14 inches by 10, of quarter-inch plate glass. The pane had been his occupation for the better part of 3 days. It was a decorative panel intended for the upper light of a front door in a house on Middleton Square, a private commission arranged through a builder who had been recommended by the ironmonger on Exmouth Market. The design was a floral border surrounding a central motif of intertwined leaves and stems, a pattern common enough in the decorative vocabulary of the period, but one that required considerable delicacy in its execution, particularly in the narrow channels between the leaves, where the etching had to be carried to a precise and uniform depth in order to catch the light evenly when the finished panel was installed. The acid work on this particular pane had been completed the day before. Edmund had painted the entire surface with a careful layer of Brunswick black, allowed it to dry, and then, using a fine steel scribing needle held in a wooden handle, had scratched through the dried resist to expose the glass beneath, following the pattern he had first drawn on paper, and then transferred to the glass with a pounce wheel and chalk dust. The tracing of the design was perhaps the most demanding part of the entire process, for it required the hand to move with a certainty that could not afford hesitation. Unlike a pencil mark on paper, a line scratched through Brunswick black could not easily be undone. If the needle slipped, if the hand trembled, the error would be etched permanently into the glass along with the rest of the design, and the entire pane might have to be discarded and begun again. But Edmund's hand did not slip. It had not slipped in many years. Once the design was scratched into the resist, he had built up a low wall of tallow around the edges of the pane, forming a shallow tray, and had then poured a carefully diluted solution of hydrofluoric acid over the exposed surface. The acid, purchased from a manufacturing chemist on Farringdon Road and stored in a gutta-percha bottle on a high shelf at the back of the workshop, was the most dangerous substance in the room, and Edmund treated it with the quiet, automatic respect that long familiarity with hazard produces. He had worked the acid trays without incident for over 20 years, having learned the craft from his father, who had learned it from a German glass etcher who had settled in Lambeth in the 1850s. The fumes, when the acid was poured, were visible as a faint yellowish haze above the surface of the glass, and Edmund always worked with the window open during this stage, regardless of the weather, positioning himself upwind and breathing shallowly until the acid had settled. The etching itself took approximately 1 hour. During that time, the acid dissolved the exposed glass at a slow, steady rate, creating the frosted channels and hollows that would form the visible pattern, while the areas still protected by the Brunswick black remained perfectly smooth and clear. This evening, the acid work was long finished. The tallow walls had been removed, the acid carefully poured back into its storage bottle, and the glass had been washed with clean water and dried. What remained was the final stage of the process, the one that Edmund found most absorbing and most satisfying, the careful hand finishing of the etched surface. He was using a very fine brass wire brush, no larger than a man's thumb, to remove the last traces of resist from the deepest channels of the design, where the Brunswick black had a tendency to cling in thin, stubborn films that dulled the contrast between the frosted and clear areas. This was slow, unhurried work. The brush moved in tiny strokes, back and forth, with a pressure so light that the bristles barely seemed to touch the glass at all. Each stroke dislodged a minute quantity of dark residue, which fell as a fine powder onto the sheet of white paper that Edmund had placed beneath the pane for exactly this purpose, so that he could see what he was removing and judge when the channel was truly clean. The lamp on the bench was an oil lamp with a brass base and a clear glass chimney, its wick turned just high enough to give a steady, yellow-gold light that fell in a warm circle across the work surface. Edmund had positioned the lamp to one side so that the light entered the etched glass at an angle, and when he leaned close to examine a particular section, he could see the pattern appear as a pale, ghostly image suspended within the thickness of the glass itself, the frosted lines glowing softly against the transparent background like a design drawn in breath upon a cold window. This quality, the way etched glass held light and released it in a softened, milky glow, was what had first drawn him to the craft as a boy of 14, watching his father work on a set of panels for a public house in Bermondsey. He had not yet understood the chemistry, the technique, the years of practice that lay between a blank sheet and a finished panel, but he had understood, in a way that required no words at all, the beauty of light passing through a surface that had been marked by human hands. Outside, beyond the muslin curtains and the 2 panes of ordinary glass that separated the workshop from the street, the first snow of the season had begun to fall. Edmund did not notice it at first. His attention was entirely given to the small section of the design he was cleaning, a place where 2 narrow stems crossed over one another, and the acid had bitten to slightly different depths on either side of the crossing, creating a subtle variation in the frost that he wanted to examine more closely before deciding whether it was a flaw or an acceptable feature of the finished work. He held the pane up to the lamplight, tilting it very slowly, watching the way the frosted channels changed from white to a pale, luminous gray as the angle of incidence shifted, the way the clear areas between the leaves seemed to deepen and darken by contrast, giving the whole composition a quality of depth that was far greater than the quarter-inch thickness of the glass could account for. He turned the pane another degree, and the pattern shifted again, the stems now appearing to recede while the leaf shapes advanced, as though the design were not etched into a flat surface at all, but somehow inhabited a shallow, three-dimensional space of its own. This was the nature of acid-etched glass, this capacity to suggest dimension where none existed, and it never ceased to hold his attention, even after all these years. He set the Pane back down on the bench and picked up a soft cloth, a square of chamois leather that he kept folded beside his tools. He breathed very gently on the surface of the glass and then wiped it with the chamois, removing a faint haze of moisture and the last invisible traces of dust. The glass was now perfectly clean. He held it up once more, this time against the lamplight, and regarded it for a long, silent moment. The floral border was precise and even, the leaves symmetrical without being rigid, the central motif balanced but not stiff. The frosted areas had the fine, dense quality that came from using properly diluted acid at the correct temperature, a surface that resembled neither the coarse grain of sandblasting nor the slick opacity of white acid, but something in between, a texture that could almost be mistaken for very fine fabric when seen from a distance. The clear areas were unblemished. There were no visible scratches from the scribing needle where it had not been intended to mark, no areas where the resist had failed and allowed the acid to bite into the wrong part of the design. It was, in Edmund's careful estimation, a good piece of work. He did not arrive at this judgment quickly or casually. He had been looking at etched glass for 27 years, first as an apprentice under his father's instruction, then as a journeyman working alongside him, and finally, for the last 6 years, as the sole occupant of this workshop. In all that time, he had produced hundreds of panels, perhaps thousands, and he had developed an eye for quality that was both precise and instinctive, an ability to see in a single glance whether the etching was even, whether the resist had held, whether the design would read clearly from the distance at which it would finally be viewed. He did not think about this ability consciously. It was simply there, like the steadiness of his hands or the patience with which he could stand at the bench for hours without restlessness, part of the quiet architecture of a life given entirely to one particular task. He lowered the Pane and placed it on a folded towel that lay at the far end of the bench, where finished pieces were left to rest before being wrapped for delivery. Then he turned his attention to his tools. The scribing needles, 3 of them, each with a steel point of different fineness, were laid out on a strip of leather beside the lamp. He picked up the finest one, held it briefly up to the light to check the condition of the point, and finding it still sharp and true, slid it into its slot in the wooden case that held his essential instruments. The case was old, made of walnut, and bore the initials J.H. On its lid, the marks of his father, James Hargrove, who had built the case himself in the years before his hands had grown too stiff for fine work. The brass hinges were tarnished but sound, and the inside was lined with green baize that had faded to the color of sage. Into this case, beside the scribing needle, Edmund now placed the other 2 needles, a small horsehair brush used for applying Brunswick black to narrow areas, a flat-bladed palette knife used for mixing the resist to the proper consistency, and the brass wire cleaning brush he had been using moments before. Each tool had its own place in the case, its own shallow groove or pocket cut into the baize, and Edmund returned each one to its correct position with the unhurried attentiveness of a man for whom order is not a discipline but a comfort. The room was very quiet. The furnace made a faint, rhythmic ticking as its iron cooled, and from somewhere above, through the ceiling, came the barely audible creak of floorboards as the tenant of the upper story. A watchmaker named Crowley moved about in his own workshop. These were familiar sounds, part of the deep background of Edmund's working life, and he registered them without attending to them, the way a man who lives beside a river ceases to hear the water. What he did attend to, because it was new, was a change in the quality of the light that came through the street-facing window. The daylight, which had been fading steadily for the past hour as the December afternoon declined, had taken on a peculiar softness, a diffused, silvered quality that he recognized at once. He looked up from his bench and saw, through the gap between the top of the muslin curtain and the window frame, that the sky beyond the glass had turned a uniform, luminous gray, and that small, slow flakes of snow were falling past the gas lamp on the opposite side of the street. The lamp had been lit perhaps 20 minutes earlier. Edmund had heard the lamplighter's footsteps, the brief scrape of his ladder against the iron post, and the soft hiss as the gas caught and the mantle glowed into life. Now the lamp's warm, orange-yellow light fell across the thin curtain of snow in a way that made each flake briefly visible as it passed through the cone of illumination, a tiny, bright point that appeared, descended, and vanished into the darkness below. Beyond the lamp, the far side of the street was almost invisible, its buildings reduced to vague, dark shapes whose outlines wavered slightly as the snow thickened. The street itself, which had been noisy enough an hour ago with the clatter of a cart and the voices of two boys arguing about something Edmund could not make out, was now utterly still. Snow has that effect on a city, he thought, not for the first time. It lays a kind of cloth over the noise of things, a muffling that seems to come not from the ground but from the air itself, as though the atmosphere had thickened and could no longer carry sound as far or as sharply as before. He stood for a moment watching the snow fall, his hands resting on the edge of the bench, his body very still. The warmth of the room enclosed him. The lamp burned steadily. The furnace ticked. Beyond the window, the snow descended in its slow, unhurried way, each flake following its own invisible path, none of them seeming to be in any particular hurry to reach the ground. He became aware, as he sometimes did at this hour on winter evenings, of a deep and particular contentment, not the sharp pleasure of accomplishment or the satisfaction of a task completed, but something quieter and more diffuse, a feeling that the room, the lamp, the tools, the glass, the falling snow, and his own still body were all, for this one moment, in a kind of agreement, a kind of balance that required nothing further and asked for nothing more. He turned back to the bench. There was one more task to complete before the day's work was truly done, and that was to clean and prepare the work surface for the following morning. He took up the sheet of white paper on which the dark residue from the cleaning brush had fallen, folded it carefully so that the powder would not scatter, and carried it to the waste bin beside the furnace. Then he returned to the bench and wiped its surface with a damp cloth, removing the fine layer of glass dust that accumulated there over the course of a working day. Glass dust was a persistent companion in a workshop of this kind. It settled on every horizontal surface, on the tools, the lamp, the window ledges, and even on Edmund's own sleeves and hair, from which he would brush it each evening before putting on his coat. It was not the same as ordinary dust, being composed of microscopic particles of silica rather than the organic matter that made up household dust, and it had a quality that Edmund had always found faintly beautiful, a way of catching and refracting light in tiny, scattered points that resembled, in miniature, the very effect he sought to create in his etched designs. When the late afternoon sun fell across the bench at certain times of year, the glass dust made the wooden surface appear to shimmer, as though the bench itself were made of something more precious than plain deal. He rinsed the cloth in the basin of water that stood on a small iron stand beside the furnace, wrung it out, and draped it over the edge of the basin to dry. Then he returned to the bench one final time, picked up the walnut tool case, closed its lid, and latched it. He placed the case in its accustomed position at the right-hand end of the bench, against the wall, where it would sit undisturbed until he opened it again the following morning. Beside the case, also against the wall, stood a small stack of design drawings on cartridge paper, held flat by a smooth river stone that Edmund had picked up on a walk along the Thames at Battersea some years ago and kept for this purpose. The drawings showed various patterns he had been considering for future commissions: floral borders, geometric repeats, and one or two more elaborate compositions featuring birds and trailing vines, all drawn in pencil with the clean, confident lines of a man who has spent a lifetime translating ideas into marks on flat surfaces. He did not look at the drawings now. There would be time for that in the morning, when the light was fresh and his eye was keen and the long, quiet hours of the working day stretched ahead of him like the uncut surface of a new sheet of glass. For now, the day was ending. The lamp on the bench still burned, and he let it burn, having no particular reason to extinguish it just yet. Its light fell on the empty bench, on the closed tool case, on the folded chamois leather, on the smooth surface of the river stone, and on the finished pane that lay on its folded towel at the far end, the etched design catching the lamplight and holding it in its frosted channels like a pattern made of captured gold. Edmund moved to the small table that stood near the furnace, where he kept a kettle, a tin of tea, a chipped cup, and a small earthenware pot of sugar. He filled the kettle from the basin, placed it on the still warm surface of the furnace, and waited. The water would take some time to heat, for the furnace was low, but he was in no hurry. He stood beside the furnace and felt its remaining warmth on his forearms and face, a gentle, radiant heat that was entirely different from the dry blast of the gas fires in the newer workshops he had visited, a slower, deeper warmth that seemed to rise not from the iron surface, but from somewhere within the structure of the furnace itself, as though the bricks had been storing the day's heat and were now releasing it gradually, like a field giving up the warmth of the afternoon sun long after. The sun has set. While he waited for the kettle, he looked across the room at the row of glass sheets standing in their racks against the far wall. There were perhaps a dozen of them, of various sizes, the largest nearly 4 feet tall and 2 feet wide, the smallest no bigger than a dinner plate. Some were clear, some partially worked, and one, near the end of the row, bore a finished design that was waiting to be delivered to a public house in Islington. That design was more elaborate than the one he had completed today. A large panel featuring the name of the establishment rendered in ornamental lettering, surrounded by a border of hops and barley in the Art Nouveau manner that had become fashionable in the last few years. The lettering had been done with a combination of acid etching and hand engraving, and the hops and barley border had required 3 separate applications of Brunswick black and acid, each one building upon the last, to create the graduated tones that gave the design its sense of depth and richness. It had taken Edmund the better part of 2 weeks to complete, and he regarded it with a quiet, private satisfaction that he would never have expressed aloud to anyone, being a man who kept his feelings about his work, as about most things, largely to himself. The glass sheets in their racks caught what little light there was in the room, the lamplight from the bench and the faint glow from the furnace, and held it in their surfaces in a way that made them appear almost alive, almost present in the room in the way that another person might be present, their flat faces reflecting and refracting the light in subtle, shifting patterns that changed whenever Edmund moved or the lamp flame flickered. He had always felt this about glass, even before he understood what it was or how it was made, a sense that it was not merely a material but something closer to a medium, a substance through which light could pass and be altered, could be caught and held and released in forms that were different from the forms in which it had arrived. A clear pane of glass was, in one sense, invisible, an absence of obstruction, a gap in the wall through which the world could be seen without distortion. But an etched pane was something else entirely. It was a surface that had been given a voice, a means of speaking to the light in a language that was visible to the eye but difficult to describe in words. The frosted areas scattered the light, softened it, turned it milky and diffuse. The clear areas let it pass, unaltered, sharp and bright. And where the two met, at the edges of the etched design, the light did something more complex still, bending slightly as it passed from one surface quality to another, creating a faint halo, a border of increased luminosity that outlined the pattern and gave it a quality of floating above the glass rather than being fixed within it. Edmund did not think about these things in scientific terms, though he was aware, in a general way, of the optical principles involved. He thought about them in the way a musician thinks about harmony, as something felt rather than calculated, something understood through the hands and the eye rather than through the intellect. His father had taught him the same way, not through explanation, but through demonstration, by standing beside him at the bench and guiding his hand along the glass, by holding finished panels up to the window and saying, "Only look," and letting the boy see for himself what the light did and how the glass responded. It was a form of teaching that was entirely suited to the craft, which was itself a form of silent communication between the hand, the tool, the material, and the light. The kettle began to murmur. It was not yet boiling, merely warming, the water inside it beginning to stir and shift as the heat from the furnace worked its way through the copper base and into the liquid. The sound was barely audible, a low, continuous hum that joined the ticking of the furnace and the occasional creak from upstairs to form a kind of quiet accompaniment to the evening, a music so gentle and so familiar that it would have been more noticeable by its absence than by its presence. Edmund stood beside the furnace and listened, or rather did not listen, allowing the sounds to pass through his awareness the way the lamplight passed through the glass, altering nothing, disturbing nothing, simply filling the space that would otherwise have been silence. He thought, briefly and without urgency, about the commission he would begin tomorrow. It was a set of 4 small panels for the transom windows above a shop front on Roseberry Avenue, a stationer's premises that was being refurbished in a modern style. The design called for a repeating geometric pattern, a grid of interlocking diamonds with a small rosette at each intersection, the kind of work that required precision above all else, for any irregularity in the spacing or depth of the etching would be immediately apparent when the 4 panels were installed side by side. Edmund had already prepared the cartridge paper drawings and had cut the 4 sheets of glass to size. In the morning, he would begin the process of transferring the design, dusting the paper pattern with chalk, laying it over the first sheet of Brunswick black-coated glass, and tracing the lines with his pounce wheel, a small brass instrument with a toothed wheel at one end that perforated the paper and left a dotted line of chalk on the dark surface beneath. Then the scribing would begin, and after the scribing, the acid, and after the acid, the cleaning and finishing. The rhythm of this process, its ordered sequence of preparation, execution, and refinement, was the rhythm of Edmund's days, and he found in its repetition not tedium, but a kind of reliable architecture, a framework that gave shape to the hours and meaning to the work of his hands. But he did not think about this for long. The morning was still the morning, and the evening had its own claims on his attention, chief among them the slow, agreeable task of doing nothing at all. He turned from the furnace and walked the few steps to the window, moving around the end of the bench to reach the narrow space between the bench and the glass. The window was a standard sash, its lower half raised about 2 inches to allow a thin current of air to enter the room, a habit Edmund maintained even in winter to keep the air from growing stale. Through the gap he could hear, very faintly, the sound of the snow falling, or rather the sound of the absence that snow created, the way it erased the ordinary sounds of the street and left in their place a hush that was not quite silence, but something adjacent to it, a quality of muted stillness that seemed to press gently against the glass from outside, as though the snow were not merely falling on the street, but settling on the air itself, filling it with a soft, cold weight. He looked through the upper pane, above the muslin curtain, and saw the gas lamp across the street more clearly now. Its light had taken on a warmer tone as the sky darkened, or perhaps it only seemed warmer by contrast with the cold gray of the snow-laden air around it. The flakes were falling more thickly than before, no longer individual points of light passing through the lamp's glow, but a continuous, shifting curtain of white that moved with a slow, undulating rhythm, now thickening, now thinning, as though guided by the breath of something vast and invisible above the rooftops. The pavement beneath the lamp was already covered, a thin, unmarked layer of white that glowed faintly in the gaslight, and the top of the lamp post itself wore a small cap of snow that had accumulated so gradually it seemed to have always been there. Beyond the lamp, the buildings on the far side of the street had receded further into the dusk. Their windows were dark, or nearly so, the occupants having either gone home for the evening or retreated to inner rooms where the lamplight would not be visible from the street. Only one window, 3 doors down and 1 floor up, showed a faint yellow glow, the flame of a candle or perhaps a small oil lamp, its light just strong enough to outline the shape of the window frame and suggest the presence of someone sitting quietly inside, attending to some small task of their own, reading perhaps, or mending, or simply sitting with their hands in their lap and watching the snow. Edmund did not know who lived in that room. He had never had reason to find out. But he had noticed the light before on other winter evenings, and had come to think of it as a kind of companion, a small, distant signal that he was not the only person awake and occupied in this part of the street at this particular hour, that somewhere close by, another pair of hands was busy with another task, and another mind was turning its own quiet thoughts over in the gentle privacy of a room whose contents were known to no one but its occupant. The kettle was beginning to sing now, a thin, rising note that indicated the water was approaching the boil. Edmund turned from the window and crossed back to the furnace, where he lifted the kettle by its wooden handle and poured the hot water into the chipped cup in which he had already placed a measure of loose tea. The steam rose from the cup in a thin, twisting column that caught the lamplight and briefly glowed before dissolving into the air above. He stirred the tea with a small brass spoon, placed the spoon on the table, and carried the cup back to the bench, where he set it down beside the tool case and stood for a moment with his hands wrapped around its warmth, feeling the heat spread through his fingers and into his palms. His hands. They were the instruments of his trade, and he knew their capacities and limitations as intimately as a violinist knows the response of a particular bow, or a carpenter knows the grain of a favorite chisel. The right hand was the hand of execution, the hand that held the scribing needle, the brush, the palette knife, the hand that controlled the angle and pressure with which each tool met the glass. The left hand was the hand of stability, the hand that held the glass steady, that positioned the pane beneath the needle's point, that adjusted the tilt of the sheet when he was examining the etching against the light. Together, the two hands worked in a continuous, wordless dialogue, each responding to the other's movements with the unconscious precision of long partnership. He had never injured his hands in all his years of work, never cut them on glass, never burned them with acid, a fact that he attributed not to luck, but to the quality of attention he brought to every moment of contact between his body and his materials. His father had told him once, when he was still a boy learning to handle plate glass for the first time, that the glass will tell you when you are holding it wrong, and if you listen, it will never cut you. It was the only piece of advice that James Hargrove had ever offered in words rather than demonstration, and Edmund had found it to be true. He sipped his tea. It was strong and slightly bitter, made with leaves that had been in the tin too long and had lost some of their freshness, but the warmth of it was welcome, and the act of drinking was itself a kind of punctuation, a quiet signal that the working day was over and the evening had begun. He stood at the bench and drank slowly, his gaze resting on the finished pane at the far end, its design now visible only as a faint pattern of shadows and reflections in the lamplight, the frosted channels catching a dim glow from the oil flame and holding it in soft, milky lines that seemed to float just above the surface of the glass. The tea warmed him from the inside in the way that only a hot drink can warm a person at the end of a long day of standing, a warmth that began in the chest and spread outward through the arms and into the fingers, loosening something that had been held tight without his knowing it, a tension in the muscles of his forearms and shoulders that came from the accumulated hours of precise, controlled movement, and that only made itself felt at the moment of its release. He shifted his weight slightly from one foot to the other, feeling the solid flagstone beneath the soles of his boots, and allowed his shoulders to drop, his breathing to slow, his gaze to soften until the details of the room lost their sharpness and became instead a general impression of warmth and amber light, and the faint, pleasant disorder of a working space at the end of its day. He thought about his father. Not with any particular sadness, for the 6 years since James Hargrove's death had given Edmund sufficient time to absorb the loss and find his way through the long, strange adjustment that follows the departure of someone who has been not only a parent but a teacher, a colleague, and a daily companion for the better part of 4 decades. What Edmund thought about now was not the absence of his father, but the presence of his habits. The way James Hargrove's manner of working had passed so thoroughly into Edmund's own practice that it was sometimes impossible to tell where the father's method ended and the son's began. The way Edmund held the scribing needle, for example, between the thumb and the first two fingers of the right hand, with the little finger resting lightly on the glass for stability, was exactly the way his father had held it, a grip that Edmund had adopted at the age of 15 and had never altered because it worked, because it gave the hand both precision and freedom of movement, and because changing it would have felt like changing the shape of his own fingers. The way he cleaned the bench each evening, working from left to right and long, even strokes, was his father's way. The way he stored the acid bottle on the high shelf with its label facing outward was his father's way. Even the cup from which he now drank his tea, the chipped cup with the faded blue band around its rim, had been his father's cup, brought to the workshop each morning from the small house on Calthorpe Street, where James Hargrove had lived for the last 30 years of his life, and where Edmund still lived now, alone, in the 2 rooms above the kitchen that he had occupied since his mother's death in 1881. These were not sentimental observations. Edmund was not a sentimental man. He was a man who noticed things, who paid attention to the details of his surroundings and his routines with the same careful, unhurried eye that he brought to his work. And what he noticed on evenings like this was not the pathos of inheritance, but its quiet persistence, the way a life could continue in the habits of another life. The way a particular manner of holding a tool, or cleaning a surface, or drinking a cup of tea could carry forward something of the person who had first performed. Those actions, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a living practice, a way of being in the world that was passed from hand to hand like the tools themselves. He took another slow sip and let his eye travel along the bench, from the lamp to the tool case to the chamois leather to the finished pane. The bench itself was a piece of furniture that deserved more attention than it usually received. It was made of English oak, 7 feet long and 30 inches deep, its surface worn smooth by decades of use to a pale, silvery color that was quite different from the dark brown of its original finish. His father had built it, or rather had commissioned it from a joiner in Hatton Garden, in the year 1862, the year he had first taken a lease on this workshop, and it had stood in this same position against the wall ever since, its legs shimmed with folded card to compensate for the unevenness of the flagstone floor. Its surface marked here and there with the faint scars of old acid spills and the ghostly rings left by countless cups of tea. The edge nearest the window was rounded from the pressure of countless forearms leaning against it, and in one spot, near the right-hand end, the grain of the oak had been worn into a shallow depression by the heel of Edmund's right hand, which rested there habitually when he was scribing, pressing down with a gentle, unconscious force that, over the years, had left its mark as clearly as any etching needle upon glass. The room settled around him. The furnace had almost stopped its ticking, the iron having cooled to a point where the expansion and contraction of the metal was no longer perceptible. The creak from above had ceased, Crowley having apparently finished his work for the evening and retired to whatever corner of his rooms he occupied after hours. The only sounds now were the faint hiss of the lamp wick, the occasional soft tap of a snowflake against the window glass, and the distant, muffled sound of a church bell, far away, tolling the hour, its notes reaching the workshop so attenuated by distance and snow that they seemed to arrive not as sound but as memory, as the recollection of a bell that had rung somewhere else, in some other part of the city, in some other December long ago. Edmund set down his cup and looked at the lamp. Its flame had settled into the steady, unflickering burn that a well-trimmed wick produces when the oil reservoir is full and the chimney is clean, a flame that gave off almost no smoke and whose light was as constant as anything in the room, a small, reliable source of illumination that had accompanied him through more winter evenings than he could count. He would extinguish it soon, when he left, but for now he let it burn, wanting, perhaps, not to break the particular quality of stillness that had gathered in the workshop in these last few minutes, the quality of a room that has completed its purpose for the day and is resting, not empty, but at peace, its contents waiting quietly for the morning to return and fill them once again with activity and purpose. He turned to the glass racks along the far wall and walked slowly towards them, not with any particular intention, but simply because the room was small and his legs, which had been standing at the bench for some hours, welcomed the brief movement. He passed the furnace, feeling the last of its warmth on his left side, and stopped before the rack that held the large Islington panel. He looked at it in the dim light, the ornamental lettering and the hops and barley border barely visible, more suggestive than seen, the way a landscape is suggested through fog. In the morning, when the daylight came through the window and struck the panel at its full strength, the design would appear in all its clarity, the frosted areas bright and dense, the clear areas like openings in a white wall through which the daylight streamed. But now, in the lamplight, the design was subdued, muted, as though the glass itself were half asleep, its patterns dreaming quietly beneath the surface, waiting to be woken by the sun. He reached out and touched the edge of the panel very lightly with the tips of his fingers. The glass was cool, as it always was, cooler than the air around it, cooler than the wood of the rack in which it stood, possessing that particular chill that glass retains even in a warm room, a residual coldness that seemed to come not from the temperature of the environment, but from the nature of the material itself, as though glass remembered the furnace in which it had been formed and the violent, molten heat of its birth, and held, as a kind of counterpoint, a permanent coolness in its finished state. Edmund had no way of knowing whether this was scientifically accurate, but it was how the glass felt to his fingers, and he had long since ceased to distinguish between what he knew about his materials and what he felt about them, the two forms of understanding having merged, over the years, into a single, seamless knowledge that was neither purely rational nor purely intuitive, but something of both. He withdrew his hand and stood still for a moment, looking at the racks. The glass sheets stood silently in their rows, their edges catching thin lines of light from the lamp across the room, their surfaces reflecting nothing but the dim, amber interior of the workshop. They were ordinary objects, sheets of silica and soda and lime, manufactured in a factory and shipped to this room in wooden crates, and yet they were also, to Edmund, something more than ordinary, something more than mere material. They were the medium through which his skill expressed itself, the substance that received the marks of his tools and transformed them into patterns of light and shadow, and in that transformation they became, if not quite alive, then at least responsive, capable of speaking back to the light that fell upon them in a language that was visible and silent and endlessly varied. He turned away from the racks and walked back to the bench. The tea in his cup had cooled somewhat, and he drank the rest of it in a single, slow draught before setting the cup down beside the kettle. Then he stood for a moment, his hands at his sides, and let the room be what it was. The lamp burned. The snow fell. The finished pane lay on its towel, its design holding the last of the lamplight in its frosted lines. The tool case sat closed and latched against the wall, the tools inside it resting in their baize-lined grooves, each one clean and sharp and ready for the morning. The drawings lay flat beneath the river stone, their pencil lines invisible in the dim light, but present nonetheless, the first faint outlines of work not yet begun, of glass not yet marked, of light not yet caught and held. There was a particular smell to the workshop at this hour, a smell that Edmund could have identified in complete darkness, a smell that belonged to this room and no other room in the world. It was composed of several things layered together so thoroughly that they had ceased to be separable. There was the sharp, mineral smell of glass dust, a scent that was not unpleasant but was distinctly inorganic, like the smell of a quarry or a riverbed after rain. There was the warm, slightly rancid smell of tallow, used both for the acid trays and for the small tin of lip salve that Edmund kept in his waistcoat pocket, a precaution against the drying effect of the acid fumes. There was the tarry, bituminous smell of Brunswick black, which lingered on every surface it had ever touched and which no amount of cleaning could entirely remove. There was the faint, oily smell of the lamp, a smell that was itself composed of the scent of the burning wick and the scent of the unburned oil in the reservoir and the scent of the warm brass of the lamp base. And beneath all of these, as a kind of foundation or ground note, there was the smell of the room itself, the old brick and the old oak and the old flagstone, the accumulated exhalations of a century of use that had soaked into the fabric of the building and could not be washed or aired or burned away, a smell that was, in its way, as much a part of the workshop as the tools or the glass or the man who worked there. Edmund breathed this air without noticing it, or rather he noticed it the way one notices the temperature of one's own skin, as a constant so familiar it has become indistinguishable from the self. If he had been asked to describe the smell of his workshop, he would have struggled, not because his senses were dull, but because the smell was too close to him, too much a part of his daily experience, to be viewed from the necessary distance that description requires. It was simply the smell of where he was the olfactory signature of his working life, and it was as comforting to him as the smell of fresh bread is to a baker or the smell of turned earth to a gardener, a smell that meant not just place but purpose, not just location but belonging. Outside, the snow continued to fall with its slow, unhurried persistence, covering the pavement and the rooftops and the sills of the dark windows across the street. The gas lamp burned on, its mantle glowing with its warm, orange light, and the snowflakes passing through its cone of illumination appeared and disappeared in their endless, gentle procession, each one briefly visible, briefly bright, and then gone, absorbed into the white accumulation below. The sound of the street was silence now, or as close to silence as a London street could come, the snow having laid its soft, heavy cloth over everything, the cobbles and the curb and the iron railings and the steps of the buildings and the lid of the pillar box at the corner, all of it covered, all of it muffled, all of it drawn into the quiet. White uniformity that the snow imposed upon the city with the gentle authority of something that cannot be resisted and need not be feared. The lamplighter would not return until dawn. His round was finished. The lamps along this stretch of road all lit and burning steadily, their mantles consuming their metered supply of coal gas, with the quiet dependability that the lamp-making engineers in Westminster had designed them to achieve. Each lamp stood as a solitary point of warmth in the gathering darkness, its glow describing a small, soft-edged circle on the snow beneath it, and between these circles the darkness deepened gradually, not to blackness, but to a kind of luminous gray, the particular shade that only snow-covered streets possess, a color that is not quite the color of the snow and not quite the color of the sky, but something in between. A reflected and re-reflected light that bounces between ground and cloud, until it fills the air with a cold, directionless radiance in which shapes are visible, but distances are uncertain, and even familiar streets take on the quality of places half remembered from a dream. Edmund untied his leather apron and hung it on the hook beside the furnace. He rolled down his sleeves and fastened the cuffs. He took his coat from the hook beside the door, a heavy woolen coat of dark gray, and put it on, feeling its weight settle on his shoulders with a familiarity that was almost affectionate. He buttoned it slowly, each button finding its hole without the need for sight, his fingers knowing the coat as well as they knew the tools. He took his hat, a plain bowler, from the shelf above the coat hook, and placed it on his head. Then he turned back to the room for one last look. The lamp still burned on the bench, and he considered leaving it alight, as he sometimes did when he planned to return later in the evening. But tonight there was no reason to return. The finished pane was done. The tools were put away. The bench was clean. He walked to the bench, cupped his hand behind the glass chimney of the lamp, and blew gently. The flame wavered, leaned, and went out, and the room was plunged into a deeper dimness, though not into total darkness, for the faint glow of the furnace's last embers still sent a thin, rust-colored light across the floor, and through the window, the reflected glow of the gas lamp and the snow cast a pale, silver-gray illumination that was just sufficient to show the outlines of the room, the bench, the racks, the furnace, the door. He stood in this half-light for a moment, the room around him quiet and warm and still, the smell of the extinguished lamp mixing with the mineral scent of glass dust and the faint, waxy smell of tallow from the acid trays. It was a smell he knew as well as the smell of his own clothes, a smell that was nowhere else in the world but here, in this room, the particular and unreproducible scent of his working life. Then he turned, opened the door, and stepped out into the street. The cold met him at once, sharp and clean after the warmth of the workshop, and the snow settled on his shoulders and the brim of his hat with a touch so light it was barely perceptible. He closed the door behind him and turned the key in the lock. The street was empty. The snow fell around him in its slow, endless descent, each flake catching a brief gleam from the gas lamp before disappearing into the growing whiteness below. He looked up at the sky for a moment and saw only the snow, filling the air above him in every direction, a million tiny points of white falling from a darkness so vast and so uniform that it seemed not to exist at all, the flakes appearing from nowhere, from nothing, from the empty space between the rooftops and the clouds, and falling, 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 with a patience that was beyond human patience, with a quietness that was beyond human quietness, towards the streets and the buildings and the still accepting ground. He turned left and began to walk towards Clerkenwell Road, his footsteps leaving the first marks in the fresh snow on the pavement, soft, shallow prints that the falling snow would cover within minutes, erasing the evidence of his passing as gently and as completely as sleep erases the day. The air was cold but still, the wind having died entirely, and the snow fell straight down in its vertical, unhurried descent, each flake independent of the others, each one following its own invisible path from the sky to the ground. He passed the ironmonger's shop, its shutters closed, and its awning bearing a ridge of white along its leading edge. He passed the narrow alley that led to the courtyard behind the buildings, its entrance already half obscured by the accumulation of snow on its threshold. He passed the public house on the corner, its windows dark at this hour, its hanging sign motionless in the still air, the painted letters of its name barely legible beneath a thin veil of settling flakes. The gas lamps along the street stood at their intervals, each one surrounded by its own halo of warm light and its own curtain of illuminated snow, and between them the darkness lay in long, quiet pools through which Edmund walked with his hands in his pockets and his collar turned up against the cold. He did not hurry. There was no reason to hurry. The evening stretched ahead of him, as unhurried as the snow itself, and whatever lay at the end of it, whether it was a meal, a chair beside a fire, or simply the moment when he would close his eyes and let the day finally release him, it would come in its own time, and he would meet it with the same quiet attention he brought to everything in his life, the same steady, patient regard that he gave to the glass and the light and the work of his hands. Behind him, in the locked workshop, the finished pane lay on its folded towel in the darkness. The etched design, invisible now without the lamplight, waited in its frosted channels for the morning, when the light would return and fill it once again with the soft, translucent glow that was its purpose and its beauty. The tools rested in their walnut case. The glass sheets stood silently in their racks. The furnace cooled toward its lowest ebb, its embers dimming, its warmth slowly draining into the bricks and the air in the cold December night beyond the walls. And through the window, the snow continued to fall, covering the sill, covering the street, covering the rooftops and the chimneys and the sleeping, silent city, falling without sound and without end, as it had fallen on London in every winter of every year that anyone could remember, and as it would go on falling, long after the lamps were out and the streets were empty and the last footsteps had been softly, gently, entirely erased. And so the workshop rests, and so the glass preserves its patterns in the darkness, and so the snow falls. If you are still awake, step back a little now. Let the image of that silent room settle behind your closed eyes. The warm bench, the folded suede, the river stone on the stack of drawings, the faint glow of the embers seeping from the furnace door. Let the sound of the snow find you here, wherever you are, that soft, muffled silence that envelopes everything, asking nothing and taking nothing. Now this stillness holds you just as the glass is held on its shelf, as the tools are held in their box, as the snow is held in the air for one more moment before slowly falling to the ground. Thank you for listening tonight. If you liked it, you can subscribe to our channel and leave a comment. Remember, tomorrow is the first day of the rest of your life. Good night.